All right, we're excited to introduce our next chair coming from Lauren IDEO. She's a community craftswoman, an artist, and organizer, and she's committed to advancing equity through art and design. So we thought she'd be the perfect person to share a little bit about what we should all be keeping in mind as we move through these projects, about what we should be asking ourselves and our partners to make sure that we're really thinking about the people behind the data. So I'll pass it over to Lauren. Can you see
Beautiful.
your
Thank
screen?
you all. Amazing. And just shout out to Harim and Jane for the invitation, and just very honored to share space with all of you today. So as Jane mentioned in that introduction, I will be talking a little bit about 3 questions to guide your design practice. I want to start off by saying these questions are by no means exhaustive, and these are questions that have worked really well for me personally, and I would encourage folks to think of these as a starting place and to build upon these and make them your own. And as we dive in, I want to share a little bit about who I am and how I articulate my story. So the hats that I wear are that of a design researcher, a community craftswoman, also had a previous life wearing the title of what is called a community designer. I'm also a poet and an organizer across those communities. At IDEO specifically, wearing the hat of a design researcher, sit within our Design for Learning portfolio, where we think a lot about learning, both within the education system and beyond. But my pre-IDEO life was very much grounded in working on the ground with community organizations and grassroots nonprofits. And so a lot of the lenses that I bring to my work are very inspired by the nonprofit space, asset-based community development, and really questioning who dictates what impact means, who has the power to make those decisions, and from personally seeing a lot of very well-intended organizations with a lot of resources not always being conscious of the many ramifications that they would often leave in their wake. Again, well-intended projects, but sometimes led to less than well-intended consequences. A question that I ask across my disciplines is, how might we create the conditions for people to feel understood in a language of their choosing? And as a poet, this question is very much inspired by my own personal practice of reading a lot of poetry. And this poem is the foundation that I look at a lot of my work from, and I wanted to bring it into this space and share it with you all today. This poem is by Pavana Reddy, and it says, "More than the desire to be loved or heard or seen, above all, I desire to be read. To be understood in one's own language is an erotic thing." Yes, I know the word erotic might feel strong in this context, but what I find so powerful about this poem is we've all had a moment like this. We've all had a moment where we do feel deeply understood in a language of our choosing, and that is the really juicy moment that I'm constantly seeking to design for my own practice. So often we talk about, we need to make sure people feel seen, or we need to really listen to people. But I would encourage us to think about, what if we double clicked into pushing ourselves to reimagine, how do we ensure that people feel understood in a language that needs no translation, and what are the conditions to get there? So as I mentioned, I will be sharing 3 questions. These are not questions that have easy answers, and that is the whole point. I actually have a very exhaustive list of my gut check questions. And again, these are just a few that I've pulled to share today. This first question is inspired by a good friend of mine at IDEO and someone I would consider a mentor named Tracy Worley. She talks a lot about the power of our biographies in sculpting our abilities as designers, period. And what she means by that is, at the beginning of our talk today, I shared a few of the hats I wear. Those of a design researcher, a community craftswoman, a poet, and those are pieces of my biography that I carry with me, regardless of what space I enter into. And those are just a few. Others I might name include an able-bodied woman, a gosei, which is 5th generation person of Japanese ancestry, an organizer of intergenerational art spaces. And we all know that who we are impacts what we do in the world, how we can imagine the future, and how our creativity manifests in our design practice. Therefore, we also know that this question, what is my biography and what does that mean for how I impact design, can serve as an anchor into what might be the perspectives that I bring in design projects, but also what are the perspectives that I inherently don't, and what are the spaces that I may have to be extra conscious about embodying as a result. Some moments where this comes up in my practice personally is in synthesis, really recognizing when might there be moments where we have a higher risk as a team of misinterpreting what someone meant to share in an interview. And thus, how do we build in gut checks to balance or mitigate that? How are we bringing back in those people that we may have learned from in a research discussion into the synthesis process, and continuing that conversation to again ask, did I hear you correctly? Is this actually what you meant to say, etc. Another way that this is tactically manifested in process for me is asking people constantly what they think I might get wrong. I ask questions like, we both know that I've never walked a day in your shoes and you've never walked a day in mine. There's a big expanse between my lived experience and yours. So when we both know this, I'm really curious to know, what is something you have a hunch we might miss on this project, given that we've never walked a day in your shoes? And can you give us some advice on that? Or is there anything that you have a hunch that we will just completely get wrong, or a blind spot on our team? And what would you encourage us to do to mitigate that? So constantly checking in with ourselves and checking in with those around us related to how our biographies impact our work, I think is a really core foundational piece that can not only push our crafts, but push the edges of our work and how we show up with integrity in different spaces. Another question I asked myself is there a through line of accountability between our team and the communities impacted by our work? So often when doing projects, our systems and structures of accountability are solely between ourselves and a client, and that's kind of where the buck stops. But when we actually zoom out to think about accountability that leads to the highest quality work and more inclusive outcomes, being held accountable to our clients alone really doesn't make sense. And if we really get honest about the ripple effects of our work at scale, it's not solely about designing for someone's interaction with a product or service. What we are actually doing is designing in a way that is impacting people's livelihoods for generations. One example of how this has shown up in my work is in a project related to developing a strategy in the workforce development space. Initially, the relationship was very much, we were going to deliver a strategy to a group of clients. And some of those organizations on the client side were working with communities who would ultimately be impacted by this project, but having that through line of accountability directly with those impacted communities wasn't necessarily something that was initially built into the process. So we designed an advisory board model through which a group of individuals with a breadth of intersections of lived experience joined us in the process as co-creators, embedded with our team, and served as guides and go, no-go voices for the duration of our project. And we also, of course, ensured that compensation included not only financial compensation, but also unlocking access and learning opportunities for this group that directly aligned with where they wanted to go and how they wanted to grow. Had we just been accountable to our clients, I have a strong hunch that our deliverable would have looked very different and would have actually, again, not pushed the quality of design that we can produce as a team. And so I encourage folks to ask ourselves, how do we create more accountability through lines that extend our systems of accountability beyond solely ourselves and our clients, and push us to really deeply embed and deeply align and build relationships of accountability with those who are impacted by our work. And this third and final question is a very simple on the surface, but shows up so often and can be a really big blind spot. Would I want someone to talk about me that way? This way. In my role as a design researcher, I have the honor of spending deep time with people and learning their stories. And I truly believe that in interactions, these stories that we have the honor of hearing are a gift. And a pitfall I often see design teams fall into after we are invited to someone's home, spend 6 hours learning about the nuances, sometimes the traumas, the healing that needed to happen as a result of those traumas, and the complexities of those experiences. And afterwards, there's a session or there's a debrief where low-income family, college dropout, single mother are on Post-its or are verbally shared. And I wonder how people that we just spent so much time with would feel if they saw the way that their stories and the complexities of their stories had been translated to low-income family, college dropout, and single mother. So this question is a very important gut check question to constantly revisit over the course of the project and think about, is that actually the language that is honoring the interactions that we've just had with the people that we've had the honor the honor of learning alongside. I also, as a result of this question and other learnings, I do not use the word user as much as possible in my practice and refer to those that we learn alongside as people. And that's, again, one shift that's happened as a result of this question. And zooming out around this question as a storyteller and as a qualitative researcher, I really believe that the nuance is where all of the juiciness is. And the more that we diminish the dimensionality of people and people's stories and the complexity that's there, we are in some ways making people incrementally or sometimes drastically less human in our process. And so I encourage folks to ask, would I want someone to treat my story this way? Would I want someone to use this language about me and how we are moving through our process? And lastly, I wanted to share 3 resources and spaces that I've learned a lot from and would encourage other folks to dive into. If some of these questions really resonate with you, Creative Reaction Lab's Equity-Centered Community Design Field Guide is absolutely fantastic. The National Equity Project is a great resource, especially for folks doing work in the education and learning spaces. And lastly, the Stanford D-School Equity Centered Framework is another fantastic resource. And lastly, I would encourage you all to try this. Build out 3 questions that might serve as gut checks in your own design practice or your own project practice for your next project, your current project. We're all sitting in the house for the most part, so feel free to put those on Post-its and put them on the edge of your computer so that they're visible, and see how/if those shift the way that you're showing up and the quality of your work as a result. And lastly, keep me posted as to how this is going. Again, these are nuggets from my personal design practice, and I'm constantly interested in learning more. So please share what you're doing, how you're doing it, and I could not be more excited to learn from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that share. As we talked about when we were scoping this, it's like even me and Jane as data scientists, we're having these moments of seeing the analogs between the design process and maybe the process of designing data products. So when you talk about synthesizing for interviews, one exact parallel is the synthesis we do from exploratory data analysis, where, you know, as data people, we like to build generalizations. But if we're generalizing about people, what are we losing? What's the context? And what is that person's lived experience? And particularly when you talk about impact, data and data products that are more and more being used to make some kind of automated decision or serve or tell a narrative for decision-making purposes, that impacts livelihoods and generations. We've heard projects about, you know, property assessment. We're talking about mortgage foreclosures. All of these things impact people's livelihood, their day-to-day, and all these pieces. So having these like 3 gut check questions really helps center the solver in the project, I think.
Yes, and I also think too, I mean, projects kind of sweep us up. It can be a whirlwind. Sometimes we just feel like we're being pushed and not necessarily grounded in that process. And that's also why these questions are really helpful for me, is they serve as anchors throughout those moments where it feels like things may be swirling in a direction and you may feel a little bit icky, but may not quite know why. So yes, 100%.
One more question before we move on. You talk about, I've heard you talk about in the past, like designing with instead of for communities. And for these projects on the Solve for Good platform, people might not be interacting directly with the communities who might be impacted by the work, but just with the project partner, who's sort of this intermediary. And they're on the ground doing the work. So how would you advise people working on these projects to discuss these things with their project partners? How can they back when something doesn't seem right? And how do they do that when they don't get the chance to have the direct interactions with the people who they might be affecting?
Yes, this is I would love to jam on this question alone with everyone on this call. And it's very much a tension that shows up in my work. And I think if I had a very clear answer to this, there would be, or a lot of the problems that we see may not be as severe. But big picture, in those instances, I usually lean into scrappy workarounds. Well, oftentimes have a conversation with a partner. So there's a few things. The first thing is partner alignment and really presenting this and decreasing the proximity between impacted communities and our team, as this is actually not going to allow us to do our best quality of work. And coming in upfront in partner conversations with that as an alignment tool. An activity that I've done is a guiding principles kind of opt-in card sort, but every single one of those guiding principles has to do with equity, inclusion, decreasing proximity, aligning with communities, being in deep relationship. So no matter what you're opting into, you're pretty much opting into being aligned with being more, again, aligned with impacted communities. So that is one way, is doing something like, how do we a card sort around guiding principles to anchor our project up front with your partner, and using some of that data, for lack of a better term, to then incentivize those partners to perhaps shift some of the ways that they're working and some of the relationships that we as a team can actually have with impacted communities. I also think that there are very scrappy, again, workarounds, reaching out to community organizations, working alongside folks who are embedded in those communities, even though they might not be directly related to that particular partner. And then of course, in those relationships, ensuring that we're compensating folks adequately for the time and energy that they're putting into working with us. But I think big picture, saying that I'm designing for you says a lot about me and not a whole lot about who is on the other side. And Tracy Worley, who I mentioned, always talks about, what does it look like for us to be in right relationship with those who will actually be impacted by our work, which is another question I ask myself. And I think for us to be in right relationship, the relationship is not, I am designing for you. The relationship is, how can we be alongside one another, checking to make sure that we are in right relationship so we can actually move forward with a design that is meeting needs that have not been met before.
So Lauren, kind of a follow-up question to that, and I'm sourcing this a lot from Lily, who spoke earlier, and you saw how they've been doing their own user design process around coming up with an application. Mm-hmm. What are some, so sometimes in these Solve for Good projects, what we're trying to do is correct some kind of historic imbalance. Like you saw, for example, with Lily's project, what they're trying to do is make it a more like fair process, that not just high income people are going to, for example, debate the value of their property or something. So mm-hmm. So Lily's question then is, if kind of you're in this process where you're trying to correct and you need to quantify people, what are some of your approaches to paying attention, not to simply describe a person as low income, dropout, or a single mother, when that may be a population you're trying to help or boost through your design process and work?
So how do you not?
Yeah, how do you not use those terms, or how do you think about them more holistically?
Yes. So this is a great question. I really appreciate the question, Lily. My answer would be that as a qualitative researcher and as someone who very much brings a storytelling lens, I can tell you that I very much lean on stories, and I really try to articulate as much as I can, the complexities, again, and the nuances of someone's story, and really lead with that at the forefront, and couple that with the quant data that can bring you dimensionality, perhaps context, perhaps historical references that center that story, so it doesn't look like just a moment, but really mm-hmm. articulates how does history live actually in this interaction, and how do those influences come into play. But in terms of a data practice and the application to that is not a realm that I have a whole lot of experience within. And mm-hmm. so I do not want to give any recommendation or advice specifically on that piece. Yes. So that's how I would respond.
Yeah. I know Jane's pointing out that we have to move on, but one of the things that we talked about in one of our EDA sessions for exploratory data analysis, telling data stories. Yes. So I think some of that is kind of encapsulated in some of your recommendations, but Jane, I'll turn it over to you to keep us moving. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was gorgeous share.